Ever wondered what sets top tier leaders apart? Executive presence, an elusive quality that radiates confidence, influence, and authority. But here is the good news, you can acquire it. Join me, Pradeep Gardner, in a power packed conversation where we unravel the mysteries of executive presence. I'm thrilled to be in conversation with Jim Smith, an esteemed executive coach. Together, we are not just exploring the importance of executive presence, but diving deep into actionable insights that you can acquire and apply in your professional journey. Tune in for insights, strategies, and a transformative discussion that will reshape the way you show up in the professional arena. Stay tuned.
The higher you go in an organization, the less your success is based on your intellectual intelligence. It's more based on how you manage and influence the moods and emotions in the room. There are a lot of studies that hover around the number 75% of your success once you move into upper middle or senior leadership. 75% is based on that capacity. And so emotional intelligence is a huge part of executive presence. How aware are you of yourself? How do you impact a room when you enter it? The way you walk, talk, sit, stand, breathe, the way you show up on stage, the impact you have when you walk into a room, the degree to which you participate in conversations. Like, do you have to be the center of the universe, or are you somebody who's holding space for others to be successful? Those are all the components of executive presence. And people who have it, I'm doing air quotes here if you're listening, the people who have it.
Welcome, everybody. We have a very interesting episode today. And as you all know, everyday leadership is about creating authentic content around entrepreneurship and leadership. We make sure that there is no fluff in all the conversations that we host here. And today, we have an exciting topic. Let's try and understand what exactly is executive presence. And I came across this term many times. I heard many leaders speak about it, and I've seen many leaders struggle with it. So they struggle with getting the attention they need so they can accomplish the things that they were supposed to accomplish. And at the same time, a lot of the early managers want to really somehow learn this skill so they can uh, put this to a good use as they grow up the ranks. So today we'll talk about everything about executive presence. And to do that, we have an amazing guest, Jim Smith, who is an executive coach for a long, long time. And I've seen this, from many, many angles. So with that context, so let's start with Jim. So Jim, can you just quickly introduce yourself and just help us understand who you are and what you do?
Sure. So Jim Smith, the executive happiness coach. I run a global coaching practice out of my home office. Um, I spent about 20 years in the corporate space working in a variety of industries and, very importantly, in a variety of functions. I worked in operations, field sales, internal marketing, real estate management. I was a CFO for a brief time when my boss discovered I had an undergrad degree in finance, and then later moved into some other service organizations and eventually landed in human resources management. So, what eventually led me to become an executive coach was, over the course of my career, realizing that in the end, at the level I was operating as an officer of a company, no one really cared what I knew. There was a point when I was moving across functions when I stopped being an expert. What people wanted from me was to be a leader, to help them get stuff done, not do it myself. And so we're going to be talking about what is that really? What does it mean to be an executive? What's the difference between being a manager or a lower level or middle level leader versus being an executive? What do you bring to the game? What's different about it? And I that all of that is informed both by my coaching work and by my 20 years of experience working across many different domains of leadership.
Well, that is awesome to know. And let's start with a very basic question. What exactly is executive presence?
you know, uh, executive presence is one of those terms that you're probably going to get as many definitions as you have people in the room at any time. So I can offer you my interpretation based on the work that I do. Um, Let me start with a little context in that um, a lot of my grounding is in the space of emotional intelligence, which you and many of your listeners are probably familiar with. Emotional intelligence is the degree to which you are aware of yourself, that you can manage yourself, and then building on that skill, the degree to which you can be aware of others. They call those empathy skills, or being able to read people, read a room, and finally, influencing others through the management and um, this is I never like this word, but the manipulation of emotions and emotional spaces, and I don't mean manipulation in an evil way. I just mean like managing it on purpose. So in the field of emotional intelligence, one of the things that research has shown us over decades is that the higher you go in an organization, the less your success is based on your intellectual intelligence. It's more based on how you manage and influence the moods and emotions in the room. There are a lot of studies that hover around the number 75% of your success once you move into upper middle or senior leadership. 75% is based on that capacity. And so emotional intelligence is a huge part of executive presence. How aware are you of yourself? How do you impact a room when you enter it? The way you walk, talk, sit, stand, breathe, the way you show up on stage, the impact you have when you walk into a room, the degree to which you participate in conversations. Like, do you have to be the center of the universe, or are you somebody who's holding the space for others to be successful? Those are all the components of executive presence. And people who have it, I'm doing air quotes here if you're listening, the people who have it, what they really possess is the capacity to notice themselves and be able to shift that based on what the people in the room need. Do they need me today to be decisive and inspirational, or do they need me to shut up, sit back, and allow them to be great? Every day, though, one component of executive presence that's really important is to regularly bring a sense of optimism and possibility into every conversation. People who are described as having good executive presence make the room better when they're in it. People who kill the mood, depress people, make them feel they're less capable, those are people who are not described as having executive presence. They're explained as or described as toxic presence. All right, so let me stop. Does that make sense?
No, absolutely. I think that, and I love how much of the executive presence really boils down to really being self-aware and being aware of your surroundings. And I also loved how presence also leads to influence, which I'm absolutely sure how useful it is, because when you become a leader, when you're trying to lead a people of 1,000 or more, I think the only way to really get things done by influencing them and then really inspiring them. And I also love to hear how much presence also contributes to that. But it also looks super complicated because it also depends on when should you shut up, when you should stay quiet, and when you should let others speak. And it there is a lot of complex setup involved in becoming one as well. Like if somebody has it, intuitively by default, I think they're blessed in many ways. But if so, my question really is, can someone acquire this skill?
Well, that's the really good news, isn't it? Yes. The answer is yes. There's a book by Marshall Goldsmith, who's widely acknowledged as one of the great executive coaches. It's one of his earlier books. The title is "What Got You Here Won't Get You There." I always recommend that book to people who are making the transition, especially into senior leadership, to help them understand when I say to them, the reason you're not good at it is because you're incompetent. And please understand, I'm not saying to you that you're stupid. What I'm saying is the degree to which people need you to show up, the executive presence that people require of you once you hit a certain level of the organization is not something anybody has asked of you before. You don't need to have executive presence when you're a supervisor, certainly not as an individual contributor. But the higher you go in the organization, the more visible you become, the more people you impact, the more you need to develop the skill of holding space rather than doing stuff, right? One of the other distinctions we often talk about with executive presence is the difference between being and doing. So you do and do and do and do and do, and you have success and you get promoted and promoted and promoted. And then all of a sudden one day, nobody cares what you do. They only care how you're being, whether it's safe to be with you, whether or not they can have a conversation with you. So the good news is it can be learned. Just like you learned to do what you needed to do at other levels of the organization, if you let go of some of the doing work and make time and give priority to being self-aware, to noticing how you show up on stage. I often teach people the skill of confidence. I mean, it's an emotion we can feel. It's amazing how many people moving into senior roles lack confidence because all their success has been based on having the right answer, and suddenly they're not the one solving the problem, right? They're the one getting resources for the other people who are solving the problem, and they don't know how to do that. They don't Suddenly they're like they don't have any basis for believing in themselves. So we work on self-awareness, self-control. Again, I mentioned earlier how you walk and talk, how you stand in a room, how you deliver on stage. Those are skills that if you learn them and practice them will allow you to build and own a different presence in the room.
That's certainly good news. The good news is it can be acquired, it can be coached, and it can be learned and put to a good use. Now, I'm also a bit curious. So, from all the experience of you coaching all these leaders, do you have maybe one or two stories to share where someone really acquired it and then they managed to get things done? And then some interesting stories, if you happen to have, kindly share it with our audience as well.
Okay. Well, I prepared two stories for this conversation. One was I was contacted by an individual who worked for, actually at the time, he worked for one of the big four consulting firms and had been passed over for partner twice. Now, if you know anything about the way the big consulting firms work, if you get passed over a third time, you just pack your box and you leave. Like you have no future in the organization. And the feedback he'd been given was that he had no presence. So we looked into that. Well, what exactly are people trying to tell you? Brilliant guy. Absolutely brilliant. I'm sure his IQ was up in the top 0.5% of the population. He was also a major introvert. Most of his success throughout his life and into his first few years with the firm was based on the fact that he could solve problems. He could keep his head down, give him data. Man, he could make that data stand up and dance. But if he was in a room, in a meeting, no one knew that because he never spoke. And there were two things going on with him. Number one, he just wasn't used to it. He had literally never exercised his social muscle, was the way he put it. And number two, the predisposition of an introvert is to let other people speak first. And, if you get invited, then you speak. Well, that's not the way his environment worked. Nobody ever invited him. And there was never an opportunity. So he just never did. So we really deeply worked on two things. Number one, it became his job to speak up in every single meeting he attended, whether it was a phone call, a teleconference, or a physical meeting with a client, with peers. He was not allowed to leave a meeting until he added something. And what happened over time was that he became more used to it, right? He didn't have the muscle of contribution. So we built that new muscle. He learned that if he spoke up proactively and added his opinion to the room, that people acknowledged him, that he didn't die, I mean, literally, that's the story some people have. And then the other thing we did was we really nurtured his capacity for asking questions. Once you move into a partner level with an organization like that, your value increases the more you can draw out the wisdom that's in the room rather than just sharing what you know. So we worked for about 1.5 years on helping him be more curious, putting on a body of curiosity, really grounding himself and asking whatever was on his mind. The end point of that, I actually worked with the guy for 2 years, then he moved on. He resurfaced a number of years later in a new assignment in a different country and hired me again to help him navigate a different culture. By the time I finished working with him, he was a senior leader in that organization. I'm not taking credit for that. I mean, he did the work of moving up, but I absolutely give coaching credit for having helped him stay accountable to developing these new muscles. Right? So that's one of my stories. So let me pause for a second and see if you have any questions about him.
No, that is a very interesting story. I think, in my opinion, I think being coached is also a good skill, in my opinion. So if you're not responding to coaching, that's a different problem. I've come across many folks like that, so who just don't respond to any feedback in coaching. But it's good to know that this, particularly this individual, managed to acquire this and eventually got promoted, and that one skill to just open up and be comfortable and to indulge in the conversations can have a dramatic effect, and that's good to hear from the story. Yeah, so love to hear another story where this really impacted someone.
Okay. Well, so the other story, a female executive in an organization had kind of plateaued. And that was the feedback the organization gave her. Like, we don't see you moving up anymore. And she's like, I don't like that story. And she connected with me as a coach. And I remember still our very first meeting we'd had a conversation over the phone, and we met in person at a little cafe. Now, I usually set up a chemistry meeting like that for about 30 to 45 minutes. And then we decide, okay, do we want to work with each other? Well, we were about 30 minutes into the conversation, and I just stopped her. And I in that short meeting already, I had probably only asked about 3 or 4 questions of her, and she did all the rest of talking. So I just stopped her and I said, "Can I share an observation with you?" And of course, yes, right. People always want to know what you think. And I said, we had been talking about some traveling she'd been doing. So I used a travel metaphor. I said, in this conversation so far, it's kind of like I asked you for directions to Albany, New York. And I said, and what you did was you offered me 14 ways to get to Los Angeles and then to Singapore and then explore the whole Indian subcontinent, and let's hit Europe along the way. And we haven't got to Albany yet. She said, what do you mean? I said, well, the pattern I've seen in just half an hour of conversation is that you're giving me everything, and I've just asked for one thing, and I'm barely getting that one thing. Is this how you normally show up? Well, she hired me on the spot because no one had ever given her that kind of direct conversation. We worked together for a few years. And again, the focus in the coaching was on her becoming aware. What was going on for her that she felt like she always had to share everything, including the kitchen sink? Once you have self-awareness, it becomes much easier to then make a different choice. So first, she had to become aware of what was triggering her. When was it happening? Why was it happening? We helped her figure all that out. And then we helped her build a different way to show up. I mean, one of the things I remember working on with her was, I'm standing right now, but I've got a chair behind me. So one of the skills we developed, and this sounds simple, but it's hard if you're not used to it, was whenever she'd be in a meeting, her job was to make sure that the lower part of her back, the small of her back, was against the back of the chair. Because we noticed that as soon as she started leaning in, she got into like resolute mode and she would just keep going. So you got to sit back, feet on the ground, back against your chair. Well, it helped her just stay calm in meetings and not lean into long answers. So if people asked her a question, she was much more succinct. And she learned how to ask more questions, because sitting back tends to bring up more curiosity in the body rather than, being tell-assertive. She was more ask-assertive, which is exactly what we need our executives to be. So again, I tell that story because she was a huge success. She ended up getting promoted within that organization, and then got hired away by a national group that had seen her at a regional level, and she ended up retiring from a much bigger job.
Oh,
It really came down to her being aware of herself.
no,
Yeah.
that is such a powerful story. I mean, there's so much going on there. Like, one, she was given a feedback that she was never given. And then she was sort of taught how to use her body to really, align herself more towards the conversation. And three, ask more questions to really understand the intent of what's being asked. So
Mm-hmm.
that is such a powerful story. Loved it. You know, now we sort of understand. So there is a value to, making sure the executive presence is taken care of. Now, my next question to you is, what are some habits or what are some daily practices that one can practice to really acquire this as a skill? And I say that because this skill is even more important, especially in the remote times. I've seen a lot of the leaders struggle, especially, back in the day, you can show up in the office, but being in remote teams now, this is even more important than ever before. So with that, so do you have any recommendations or practices or anything that one can do at home to really hone this skill?
I love the question. What can you do at home? Yeah. All right. So here are a couple of ideas. Um, let me start with the reference to the body that you already drew out, across my stories. Um, we have a lot of wisdom in our bodies. It's not just, I mean, our body is our brain is our body, it's all one unit, but we tend to give all the energy to this, right? So first, be aware that you have a body. Notice how you're using it. Now, let me point to something that's really specific to video conferencing. When everyone is sitting around a room physically, you'll notice people, some people sit back, some people sit forward, they shift around a lot. Um, they turn, they look at the other person. But when everything's right in front of us in a window, we tend to focus just on that screen and it pulls us in. We will lean in. Well, when you lean in, what gets activated is your resolute, let's get something done energy. And you can end up talking too much, pushing against other people, um, taking too much airtime, simply because that's what your body is programmed to do. You're leaning in, therefore it's moving forward. Kind of like if you are standing up and you lean forward, what happens? Your body starts falling. You have to follow that energy. So my one of my top recommendations is keep sitting back. Keep sitting back. Or do what I do. And I think what you do, Pretty, too, is you've got a standing desk, which allows you to shift and move around a little bit and recalibrate and not always be falling into the screen. Okay. Um, the other is to be aware of your breath. Um, every emotion that we feel has a body and a breath that goes with it. And for anybody who's listening who's familiar with the term the mind body connection, you probably know the mind body connection is what we think, how we interpret events turns into an emotion, which then shows up in our body, right? We expand or we contract, we move away, we move toward, we get excited, perspiration, respiration all change. Well, if you're aware of the mind body connection, it's not just something you're victim to. You can also manage it. If you put on a particular body, you can actually create the emotion that goes with it, which will then change your thinking. So if you want to come across as confident, then put on confidence. Confidence is, grounded feet, tall body, stable, like a lighthouse, right? Well, if you wear that for a few minutes, your emotions will start to align with it and you will become more centered in the way you speak. I mean, we could do it in other ways too. If I have you cross your arms, roll your shoulders forward, and scrunch up, your breath will come up shallow. You'll start to feel afraid, and you could end up panicking in a meeting. We can do all kinds of things with our body. So notice how your body shows up when you're in the space you want to be, and then make a note of that and then practice putting that on purpose. Like, put it on the wall over here, put on a coat hook. If you need to be more present, put on presence. If you need to be more assertive, put on assertive. If you need to get something done because nothing's happening, then lean in on purpose, like I was talking before, and notice how suddenly it's a lot easier to push a decision. Okay? So you can do all that in the virtual space just by being aware of what you're doing in this square on the screen.
Awesome. And just love that. I think simple practices, yet they have such remarkable results. And these are very asymmetric results, right? So these are not, you put in X and then you get X, but you put in X, but you're getting many, many times of what you're putting into it. Uh, but that was awesome. I think we're almost at the end of the pod, Jim, but I have an interesting section to close this. And I ask about some of your favorite things, and then we will use that to close this part. And my first question is, what's your favorite book that you want to recommend?
My favorite book. Oh gosh, I read so many books. I'll tell you what, right now I have a favorite book simply because it's impacted me so powerfully. It's called A Day in the Life of Abed Salama. It is a true account. It's a fictional account, excuse me, it's a nonfiction book about a fatal bus crash in Jerusalem a number of years ago. And I learned about this much about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and how it has decades long roots. It has really impacted the way that I'm looking at current events right now.
Awesome. And a favorite business leader that you follow?
Well, I already mentioned Marshall Goldsmith, but let's see, favorite. Whew. I'm drawing a blank. Let me come back to that one.
And favorite life hack, if you have any?
I'm sorry, favorite what?
A favorite life hack, something that you do that.
A favorite life hack. Well, my current favorite life hack is I use an online program called FocusMate, which is simply you sign up for a session, you show up in a room with another person who's trying to get something done, you take 60 seconds to declare what you're going to do, and then you stay on camera with that person. It is a hugely productivity tool for me and other people like me who get easily distracted.
That is awesome. I've heard that one before as well. But well, I mean, thank you for being here, Jim, on this pod and sharing all those valuable lessons. I'm sure, I think this is one of those best episodes on executive presence, very crisp and with a lot of actionable stories and actionable insights. So thank you really for being here and sharing all those stories.
It's been my pleasure, Freddie.